Hello and welcome to our Voices in Montessori podcast, brought to you by the Greenspring Center for Lifelong Learning. As Dr. Montessori said, an education capable of saving humanity is no small undertaking. We agree, so let's get to work. I'm Tamara Sheasley Ballas, and in today's episode, we're talking about how to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations into the fabric of our school communities and into our classrooms for early childhood and elementary students. We dig into bias, privilege, and so much more, sharing how we as adults, both teachers and parents, can support our students in these important conversations. My guest today is Jen Cort. Jen has been an assistant principal, consultant, and has her own podcast, Third Space with Jen Cort. She is a keynote and featured speaker working with schools throughout the United States and internationally. Jen is both a clinical social worker and a licensed clinical and board-approved clinical supervisor. She has served as a counselor in elementary, middle, and high schools, held private practice as a professional coach, and supervised counselors new to the profession. Jen hosts the internationally syndicated podcast, Third Space with Jen Cort, focusing on equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. The New York Times, Boston Globe, and Washington Post have quoted Jen, who authored Hubs, Help Us Begin Mindsets and Strategies for Challenging Conversations. Through activities, sharing research, and blending strategies with balance, Hubs supports people of all ages to become better community members. So, welcome, Jen. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. We've been trying to do this for so long, and I learned so much from you every time. Full disclosure, we've had Jen in to present to our staff. She's somebody that we have our own equity and belonging coordinator in touch with for coaching. So, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. I'm always so happy to be in any space with you. So it's pretty much when you ask, I just say yes and then wait to find out what we're doing.
Well, it's always having you. It's so interesting. And I was just telling Jen that I'm so glad to have you on a podcast because you give so much information. And now I can listen to it back so I can make sure I get everything out of it because there's so much. So, okay, so we're going to dig right in.
Okay.
Today, Jen is going to, my first question for you is like, how early is too early to start talking to children about this work?
It's such a fascinating question. Thank you, because there's so many different ways that we could come at it. The reality is that for many families, the conversations start in utero. If you are a family who is from a historically marginalized group, particularly if you're not white, you're talking and thinking about this with your baby, most likely from the very beginning. White families don't do that as much. And so it feels like this at what age thing. But we also know we have a lot of really wonderful brain research, and it's showing us that by age 4, many of the biases that kids develop are already in place. And I want to just caution everyone here that when you're listening, to just dismantle the idea of bias with the pejorative language that we've used in our society. We really weaponize the word. The reality is the word bias is simply the way the brain sorts, categorizes, and makes sense of the world. It doesn't, saying you're biased does not mean that you're racist or homophobic or anything like that. Saying you're biased, it means that you have a brain and you're alive. And that's literally all it is. It's what we do with our biases that becomes the stickier part. So we know by age 4, there's several biases that form. They're primarily with the identities that children look at and believe to have an answer to. So, for example, body size, gender, ability, if somebody's in a wheelchair or has any other device, race, are among those that they form these biases. So all that means is they either know someone and so it feels familiar, or they don't and it doesn't feel familiar. I mean, it's not that simplistic, but it can be. At around 4 until around 12, there's a lot of plasticity. So we can work with those biases to move them into working for them instead of working against anyone. always central in everything I do is to remember that a shamed brain, a scared brain, a traumatized brain can't learn. So when we're talking about bias, we're not talking about blaming children or making children feel guilty or making adults feel guilty. We're simply saying, let's recognize this as a human experience. And then what do we do with it? And it's that what do we do with it part that I find really empowering. So when we're thinking about how early do we start, we can start right away. We can make sure that if we're reading books to our babies, that we are reading books with lots of representation in them. It doesn't mean you need to point everything out. You just need to be continually exposing to lots of different representation. And you could just simply think of the identities you hold, like your race, your gender, sexual orientation, and more, and look for books with representation that are not those or those and others. And that's a good way to think about it. Music, same thing. Shows, your friends, people, exposure, exposure, exposure. The other part that I think is really interesting with young kids, because people often feel like we don't want to ruin their innocence, and but there's no brain that I know of that's better prepared for an equity conversation than a 3 and 4 year old. They're all about fair and unfair. That's all they focus on, and so we can tap into that by talking about something as profound and simple as all people are good people and some people are not treated the same way as others. That's an example of unfair. And just acknowledging that, and then you can build on it layer by layer. It's the I always think about it like teaching children to read. You don't sit them down with a book. And ask them to read the words with big sentences and everything. You start off with letters and pictures and sentences, and then you put them together and you build upon them each other so that then they get up to a chapter. But I think a lot of adults think we're starting at a chapter, and that doesn't, you wouldn't teach that at that age.
So really for like our toddler and early education or early childhood classrooms,
Mhm,
we're talking about exposure through representation. We're talking about who do we have on our walls, right?
mhm,
Like what's the artwork represented? What are the books in the community? What are the conversations we have with the children? And I think it's really important. I think this is really critical when we're looking for books, when we're looking for things for our community. We're not looking for books that say, see the Black family here?
yeah,
Like, that's not the goal. The goal is here is a beautiful family who happens to be Black, who is out for a hike or
mhm,
who is out doing, it's about having it be this natural integration
mhm.
rather than here's the person who's in the wheelchair, right? And does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I would also add in the toddler rooms, you're also thinking about who's teaching them. What representations do the people they see all day have, and how are they talking about those representations? So there's a lot to it. I think well, a common situation that I hear from parents is, let's take a wheelchair for example. A child will say, why is that person in a wheelchair? And the parent might get very uncomfortable and say, we don't ask that. Well, saying we don't ask that is an unintentional, of course. The intention is let's be respectful, but the unintentional message is this is secret and secrets are bad. That's generally how we think about it in society. So instead, thinking, getting ourselves out of the way, because most of us were raised when we couldn't talk about wheelchairs and race and others, and saying, well, everybody moves differently, and this person uses a wheelchair to move, to get around. And so we're not minimizing it. And that's important. You don't want to dilute it. But the more that you pull out lots of different examples, and again, without pointing them out, because that's not really the thing we want to be doing either. We're just trying to show people doing in all different ways, doing all kinds of things, being wonderful people.
Mhm. And I think there's a piece in there about not shaming the child
Oh, yeah.
for asking the question, right?
Yeah.
Like we center our own discomfort oftentimes I remember when one of my children was very young, she got on the elevator and she said to the gentleman, "Why are you so fat?"
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
And so body, right? We're talking about
Right.
body type and all
Yep.
those things. And of course, I'm mortified. I'm centering how I feel in that moment, not necessarily how the person, of course, I'm worried about how he feels.
Mhm.
And so, can you talk about that kind of situation? Like, how are we talking to the child, the young child who just said, let's use that example. Why are
Yeah.
you, why are you so fat?
And that's such a hard one because it's happening fast. And I mean, there's no better place for our biases to make decisions for us than when we're in a hurry. I mean, biases love when we're in a hurry. We can't think really clearly. We're very reactive. So that's a hard one. And then when it's our child, I mean, remember my kid's preschool director used to say, your kids are your hearts with legs walking around, and they're always exposed to the world. So you feel even more so. Add in the layer of that many people who are parents now were raised to say you couldn't acknowledge a wheelchair, you couldn't acknowledge race, you weren't supposed to have these conversations, and that's a very loaded conversation.
Mhm.
So I always suggest to parents, come up with some scripts that you'll use in a situation like that. It could be that you have what I think of as scaled responses, like what I'm going to say right away, and then if your child keeps asking questions, what do I do? So it's important to acknowledge the person that's said to, because you want to model for your child that even when we don't intend to be hurtful, we can be, and we want to acknowledge that. So even just saying, thank you for being kind to my child, or something, we're working on this and I really appreciate it, or something that just, or I'm sorry, anything that lets them know. You don't want to do like a big apology because that does add to shame for your child, but just acknowledging it. Another strategy that I like in any situation when we're feeling anxious is to use one sentence, because when we're anxious we fill space with words and we go on and on. So a script of one sentence, something that's acknowledging that person. In an elevator ride, it's going to go really quickly. And then also saying to your child, well, people come in all different shapes and sizes. And we're going to talk about that as we go on through life. Just acknowledging it as a fact, because they're not asking a pejorative question. It's a fact based question. And kids at that age are looking for, what you're saying doesn't make sense with what I know in my brain. So, for example, a kindergartner who I was working with a school, and the parent was very upset, saying that the school was saying that their kindergartner was racist. Well, when we looked at what happened, they weren't saying he was racist, but he had said, he's a white child, and he had said to another child, "But you're not black." And so it was, you can imagine all the repercussions that came from that. Plus, it came to them a couple of days later. When you listen to the child, what he's literally doing is looking at a black crayon and noticing that it doesn't match. And that's fair and true, and we need to acknowledge it, but the way the adults heard it was through their lenses of bias and privilege and societal messages and everything, and they thought, "Oh my gosh, he's saying all these things." No, he was literally saying, "I'm learning my colors, and this is not the color that I see you to be." So then they had to have a conversation about how people use words to label themselves that may not be the words you might see, but those are the words that are important to them, and that's what they're gonna use. It's always very tricky, but if you stick with a script in one sentence, it will help you to just have think time, because most often when we have think time, we can work our way through it.
Mhm.
The one other piece I would add is that I think we should be really comfortable as parents. Even as I say it, I immediately thought of the number of times I've not been comfortable with it. But we need to be comfortable saying to our children, "I don't know, but we're going to learn together, and let's figure this out. Let's learn together." We do that about anything, right? If your child wants to take apart a computer and you don't know how to do that, you'd probably look it up. Assuming you have a computer they can take apart. Not a great example, but we do that about everything. So we need to normalize that we are not expected to know everything about everyone, but we are expected to be curious and thoughtful and to learn. And also to acknowledge, like in the elevator, that was a classic example of intent and impact. That child was not intending to be hurtful, and the reality is they probably were, and both are true, and both need to be supported.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, so I'm gonna give you another scenario,
Okay.
another real life scenario, because
Remember,
that
I
was
got up
so
at 2:30 this morning, so
Yeah, Jen took a 5 a.m. flight to get here to be able to do our podcast. We feel so honored. And here we are staring out at the snow, right, on this
Yes.
beautiful snow day. So, okay, so here's another scenario from this was from a Montessori 3 to 6 classroom, and it was a 3-year-old who went home and he said to his parents, he was a white child, he's a white child. He said, "I don't like people with brown skin."
Mhm.
And his parents called us and said, "What are you teaching him? Where is he learning this?" And our poor teacher at the time, this was many years ago, she didn't know how to respond to that. Like that felt, so what can you share with us how you would have stepped into that?
How old was the child?
He was 3.5.
Okay, so at 3.5, it's same and different. And we also have to remember that a 3-year-old's vocabulary it doesn't have a lot of nuance to it. Things are either good or bad, I'm happy or sad, I'm tired or not. And so that to me sounds like he probably, I'm guessing, has not had a lot of experience with many representations. So seeing someone who looks very different than him feels unfamiliar. And when we're unfamiliar and we're thinking in a very binary way of thought, good or bad, we will put something that's unfamiliar in the bad category. But we can undo that, especially a 3-year-old. There's time to work through that with them and say, let's think about other words. The things we don't want to do are, first of all, make the child feel ashamed or make the parents feel ashamed, because parents often feel like you're judging them as well, which means it's hard to partner with them, also to support the teacher. But then also have conversations, and just it's that's an indicator to, we need to be doing more in a different way. But we also do not want to talk him out of his feelings or tell him he's wrong, because what a child learns in that situation is not to talk to you about it or not to say it about you. And that's really not where we want to go. So instead of, when I say not talking them out of their feelings, I'm not saying you sit there and go, yeah, you continue to do that. I'm saying, like, unpack it. That's a sentence I don't know what to do with. Let's think about this. What do you mean by that? What do and not a big long conversation, because the recent research shows that a child should sit still listening for something about approximately a minute for every year of age. So you want to have like small snippet conversations that build up for him what you're doing. Um, and then the other part is to also check ourselves, because we can become very performative and overcompensating. And by performative, I mean, look at me, I'm going to this rally, or I'm doing this to kind of overcompensate. Um, Please go to rallies and protests. It's important that we stand up for our fellow citizens, but we don't want to do it in a reaction or in a way that looks like this is what I'm doing for this. Instead, it could be, that's a pretty wonderful conversation for a parent and child to have. Like, I don't know a lot about this either. We're going to learn about this together. And it puts a child in a learning role.
Hmm. That's such a nice response for parents to have, is to say, and that's like you said, to have the script, right?
Mhm.
I don't know a lot about this. We're going to learn about it together, right?
Yeah.
And we brought in some books to the classroom and had the our guide start reading some of those. That really helped. We realized that he had had an interaction with another student where he was uncomfortable. And so
Mhm.
that for him, it was one student that he had, like you said, it was
Yep.
black.
Yep.
I don't mean to
Yep.
use black and white here, but
Yeah.
it was one of those things where it was one person had impacted him, and he was trying to communicate a feeling, which is the other way we really try to help our students be able to articulate those feelings beyond "I don't like." So what's were you feeling scared? Were you feeling frustrated? And and with who? Now, is that too early to talk to them about that?
No, I mean, I think I would reframe the question to ask something like, what happened the first time you remember feeling this way? What was happening? Or was there anything, at the beginning, like if it was the beginning of the story, what was happening? 3 is hard with time because it doesn't mean anything and it means everything. Um, this is why little kids, ask us over and over again, is it tomorrow? Is my birthday tomorrow? Because they don't understand the concept of the passage of time. So if you're asking something like at the beginning, you'd want to have a few questions you could ask. Like, when else have you thought this? Have you ever been with somebody else and you were thinking this? And think also for parents, some of the scripts that can help us. I mean, the script that helps me the most as a practitioner and high school counselor and parent and human is I didn't learn about that when I was your age. And so we're going to learn together and let's talk about how we treat each other when we make mistakes. I
Mhm,
mean,
mhm.
pretty like I can use that in any situation. I can anything. Um, the other part is that I think it's really important to help empower kids to be the helpers because the examples you're giving are highlighting that our society does not treat everyone the same way. And the same way if, a young child's brain is wired for fair and unfair and same and different, they're also wired for I want to be the helper and I want to be empowered to do things. Especially in a Montessori school where they're learning things that a lot of other schools parents are going, "Wait, your kids are making egg salad at age 3?" Yes, they are. um so I think that's the other part is to have kids always think about, yes, there are people who are not treated fairly. What can we do when we see that? How can we be helpers and anything along those lines to just get them thinking and switching the narrative in their mind, which also means we're gonna have to check our narrative because our narrative is really loud.
Mhm. Right, and pay attention to our own biases, right?
Yep. Yep.
And acknowledge them
Yep.
without shame,
Yes.
which all the things, right? There's
It's hard.
so many things to think
It's
about.
it's hard, and parents often think we're saying that their child's a racist and therefore they're racist. I'm just using race as an example. And this is such a hard thing for me when I'm working with folks because it feels like a foreign language in my mouth. And I know people have said it feels very different for them too. It's acknowledging that you have bias does not mean that you are prejudiced. Not acknowledging that you have bias could very likely lead you to have prejudice.
Okay, can you say more about
Yeah.
that?
So there's a lot of conversation about how we don't want to say bias or that we have privilege because those are bad words and because they're very pejorative about us. And so let's protect them from these conversations. Because if we say that somebody's bias is showing or their privilege is evident, the interpretation that many people will make is that you're also saying that I am discriminatory and prejudiced. That's like the bouncing, 1 plus 1 equals 4. In this place, I do know 1 plus 1 equals 2, but I'm saying we're leaping ahead. The reality is not acknowledging that we have bias, again, the way the brain sorts and categorizes, not acknowledging that we have privilege, which does not make us, it doesn't mean that we think we're better than anyone. We all experience privilege in different ways. Not doing that will most likely lead to prejudicial thoughts and behaviors because it goes under the surface and it's not questioned and it's not supported and it's not you're not thinking it through, and all of that should be done again without shaming anyone but just looking at it as factually at a developmentally appropriate way and how your child can be involved in affecting change and being vulnerable enough yourself to admit that you're learning with your child. All of that is okay.
Whew. I mean, that's so beautiful. It simplifies it actually quite a bit. Now, it feels like a lift for
Yes.
sure. It's a different way of thinking, but I love anything that takes the shame away.
Mhm.
I want to ask you a question at the end, towards after we get. I want to talk about elementary, and then I want to talk
Okay.
about white privilege specifically
Okay.
because that came up in a conversation with yesterday
Yeah.
with a parent. Um, but can we talk about at the elementary level? So you have children first through sixth grade, let's say.
Mhm.
How are you talking about bias with them? Like, what are those? I'm sure it's different. A 6-year-old is different than a 12-year-old.
Yeah. Yes. So if I'm gonna think through from the younger ages, from 6
Okay,
on up.
perfect.
So if I think about what is traditionally first and second grade, they're beginning to have their anchor first grade, kindergarten, first grade, they're beginning to have what I call anchor memories, which is whatever's happening at that time becomes kind of the norm. So before that, we can remember flashes. It's almost like snapshots, and after that we have movie memories, still flawed because memory is always flawed. But so before that age, we might think, oh, I remember going to the mountains and it was cold. After that age, I might remember I went to the mountains, it was cold, and my family was there and we had ice cream. Whatever's happening at that point in brain development becomes the norm for them. So we want to talk to them about how their brains are always adding new things to itself. It's always collecting. The brain is like a scavenger. And I really like this with first and second graders because often they're very into collecting and sorting. That's a big thing for them. And so if we can think about how the brain is always collecting things, it's collecting examples of when people are treated well and when they're not. It's collecting examples of what is fair and unfair, examples of same and different. Those kinds, that's one way I like to get them thinking about it. And for that age, I usually like to talk about the difference between equity and equality. Equality, a first grader gave me this example, or no, kindergartner gave me this example. Equality is everyone gets shoes. Equity is I get the shoes that fit me and work for what I'm trying to do. And so that's they're primed for that. And if you think about it, that's not saying bias, that's not saying privilege, that's not saying, sexual orientation or any of those things. It's simply saying this is like I'm working with where your brain is right now. As they move to say third and fourth grade, and this is not hard static or anything like that, but as they move to third and fourth grade, many of them are also beginning some of the chemical changes of pre-adolescence, which we need a heavy lift on because that's a big one to think about now, how that's changed. So at those ages, they're really beginning to think in a different way about relationships. This is often when they're younger, they might have a best friend. I'm using air quotes, and when they're older, that best friend might be somebody that they're more choosing to be. So, for example, and when they're first, second, kindergarten, and on, a lot of their social lives are constructed by their parents. And when they're in third and fourth grade, they're beginning to have more of their own interests. And so their friends may orient around those interests rather than the friends that they had that their parents helped them spend time with outside of school. They like them when they're younger, but it's just different. They now have more things in common. So in that, we want to think about labeling and unlabeling. We want to think about the power that we have to stand up for someone and stand with someone. We want to think about words and questions, how we ask questions with curiosity. So those, again, these are all the building blocks of what we want to do, but we're not sitting down having a geometry conversation when we haven't ensured that they know 1 + 1 is 2.
Hmm.
And then fifth and sixth grade, they are, sixth graders are really moving into pre-adolescence. And so they become much more focused on themselves in relation to the rest of the world. So then it's, are you the same as me? Are you different? If you're different and I don't have any exposure to thinking about differences in a positive way, then I could decide my brain will tell me it's a negative. So we want to also help them. The biggest thing that I think is important at that all ages, but really at that age where they're viewing themselves in relation to the rest of the world, is to develop a healthy concept of self and
Hmm.
listening to their inner life and their inner thoughts, and then building on those previous skills of equity, of labeling and unlabeling, of sorting and categorizing. If you do all of that with the positive self, it creates more of a net to carry them. And I will say, I talk about privilege with very young children, and I 3-year-olds, we're talking about privilege, but we talk about it differently. So, do you want a story?
I'd love a story, and because this is exactly what came up yesterday, so I'm so glad we're talking about
Oh,
this.
good. So this is a story. I've quoted them. They're my colleagues. Every student I work with, I call them my colleagues. And by the way, it's funny because the little kids have said, we're not a dog like a collie, or we're not in college. Um, but I was working with a school. It's a JK to 8, so junior kindergarten to 8th grade. I was working at the middle school, and the head of the lower school asked me to spend some time with the older grades and said, I don't really think you need to work with the younger grades because they're not there yet. And I said, can I try? So I walked into a morning meeting, and the kids were very upset because the class that they called the fours got to the playground faster than them, and they got all the good equipment before they got there. So we looked at why that happened. Why does that happen? And they said, I said, they're older than you and bigger than you. Shouldn't they get to go first? And they go, no, that's not fair. It's like, okay, so that's one. Um, their classroom's closer to the playground and they might be able to run faster because they're probably taller. So shouldn't they get there first? No, that's not fair. And I was like, so this is an example of what we call a privilege, meaning something you get a step up, you get help with that you probably didn't even ask for. So fours getting to go to the playground first because they're four is age privilege. It means they're four, so they should get to do more than three when you're three. And the kids were getting all this, and then they were coming up with other examples. And then I said, and also their classroom's closer. So that's what we call geographic privilege. It just means you're physically closer to something. So you can see details. You can see if a slide is muddy and you know to avoid that slide. You didn't ask for it. Doesn't make you a good or bad person. It's just simply the fact that your classroom's closer. So we then began a series of negotiations with the other groups and came up with a schedule that's far more complicated than my brain can understand, but they understood it. And then when I went back at the end of the year, I was asking him how it went. And it was so interesting because I said, okay, I always like to say, ask them, are you ready for like a 5, 6 year old question? So, what are you going to do when you're a four? And then they go, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Because the thing is that privilege feels good, and it's something we don't even notice it's there. So you're closer to the playground, you might not even think about this conversation, but you might run faster." And they're like, "Oh." I said, "Yeah, so you can help change that." And so one of the children said to me, I love this, he said, "You better write this down because I can't write yet, so that I'll remember next year." And the next year, they start a conversation with that other class about how they use the playground. And if I'm not in there talking about white privilege or anything like that. I'm just simply saying that there are things that happen to experiences that we have that we may not have asked for, that they just make it easier for us. And then, so if I was doing that with them, if I was working with that whole school, I would then build on that with the first and second grade and ask them to be detectives looking for when they see signs of equity, or when they see signs of people working against privilege, of thinking about privilege in a different way. So they're the detectives for it. And then
Mm.
they report back.
Can you give us some of examples of what they've come up with along the way? I think that's fascinating.
Oh, the detective work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a student who had a little notebook. It was so cute. Um, I love when I get to go to schools over the course of time because I'm like flying on the wall and then I get to check in with them. So examples would be if you're coming in from recess and you have to go to the bathroom. If your bathroom's closer to the door, then you get to go before class. If you have a lunch ticket versus your lunchbox from home. If you have a lunchbox from home, you are going to eat faster. And at this school, you go out for recess after you eat. So you eat faster than if you have a ticket. So all these things that then the teachers had, and we worked with the parents and we worked with the teachers, but for a little bit of time, it didn't take a lot. Then the teachers had the ways to building on their amazing skills already to intentionally support these conversations with their children, with their students, and bringing parents into it because it's hard. I mean, the other piece I'll add on this is that I think we also need to give ourselves permission to feel belief grief. I mean, belief grief is when what you've always believed to be true of yourself or others, you find out it isn't. And we often want to fight against that. So thinking, I'm a good person, therefore I'm not biased. I loved thinking that. I loved thinking that. It was so hard when somebody told me it wasn't true. And I fought it. I mean, I thought I'm Quaker, I'm a social worker, I'm a school counselor, like I'm all the things. I'm not going to be biased. And then I realized I have a brain and therefore but that was hard, and we need to let ourselves be in the hard, because if we're not in the hard and recognizing it, then we're gonna keep perpetuating it, and we want better for our children.
Mm. Wow. There's so much here. I'm so glad like I said, I'm so glad I get to listen to this again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind,
Mhm.
are there lessons that you bring in for the children along the way? Or is most of what you're doing responding to what they're off what's coming up in the classroom. Like it's a
Mhm,
great example of they're talking about the equity getting to the playground.
mhm.
Perfect example. But are there lessons that you're offering to help this? Is it mostly based on books? How do we incorporate some of this into our classroom?
Yeah. Um, well, the example with the playground was not a lesson. It was simply that the middle school was off on a field trip, and so I asked if I could meet with them. The example with them being equity detectives, that was something that I knew this school, it's the same school, ends in 8th grade. And one of the questions I always ask schools, I've asked your school this, when your students graduate, what social, emotional, and relational skills do you want them to have? And so then you cull those down because we always have a whole bunch, but they really come down to a few things: to be respectful, to be kind, to be thoughtful, to believe in themselves, a few things. So then you look at what those goals are and then you think about the specifics. Okay, you want them to be kind. One of the factors in being kind is to be able to be thoughtful and ask questions in a thoughtful way. So we know that that's a skill they're going to have to be kind. So then you back that skill down to the youngest grade. So we know we want them to finish 8th grade with being able to ask questions with curiosity and care. So we build that all the way down. And so you're just like math, you're scope and sequencing it, as we always say in schools, you're scope and sequencing it. So you're starting with where do we want them to be? Where are they starting? And then how do we build the bridge from one to the other so that they're layering on top of each other?
Hmm.
And then I do have, and well, this is free, so it's not even a plug, a shameless plug or anything. But on my website, I frequently put up lessons for all ages because I'm such a nerd. I need a better hobby. I write advisory and classroom lessons for fun. so so I frequently I put them up on my website quite a bit. Mostly I put them on social media, but I'm happy to give them to anyone. There's something on fair and unfair, labeling and unlabeling. Um, that those are all lessons that I've written after issues. So I'm like, how would I proactively work on that? With books, depending on what you're talking to them about. So if it's a first and second grader and they're being equity detectives or privilege detectives, we want them to point out in the books when they notice it. And then we also want them to be thinking about what could happen in this story to make that not true or to make that true for you. I've also done things with classes where we'll say, okay, we're going to read this story. These are the characters. And we don't, by the way, we want to make sure that we're not using words like this is a book with a character for a child who's in a wheelchair, because that's really, we want to just make sure it's a representation. Um, so we'll say these are the characters. What do we hope their experience is together? What do we hope for them? And then let's look for when it's happening. And when it's not, let's stop. You can stop me when it's not happening and let's talk about what we could do instead.
Hmm.
So it's bringing them in and making them co-teachers or colleagues, not dogs.
No, not calm. Right. Okay, so one more question on that because I think this
Yeah.
is fascinating. I love 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 this conversation. So rich, so meaningful and really doable, which I think is really important. We talk about
Yeah.
this and I think it can be really scary when
Mhm.
particularly you're starting the conversation. Just would you mind giving the language that you give when you're talking to them about being an equity detective, like you're presenting this concept,
Uh-huh.
and help us know what age is really that and where are you, what are you saying?
So I wouldn't start off with them with that, because when you first start in Jen Cort's dream school, we would start talking with our children as soon as they came in. So let's say they're toddlers, about fair and unfair. And your teachers are already doing it. When somebody goes over and takes a toy from somebody, they're saying, how do you think that made that person feel? And so they're already doing it. We just need to add some more to it. But then I would just start being really intentional about the language. Let's think about equity, what's same and different, because that's, and or equity and equality and the differences of those. Pick one of those and then incorporate that language and make sure you're reinforcing it just like you do everything else. If they have a theme of the week, it's a apple. Then you're also having a apple, or I don't know, question, let's say Q, because I'm picking on that today. but cue, quirky, asking questions. So you want to just build it into what you're already doing. What doesn't work is when we say we're going to do diversity now, or we're going to have our diversity class now. We should have those to go deeper, but if we think about it like what would be a good example? Oh, everyday math. Teachers do math lessons with the kids in the class, and then they tell parents, please encourage your child to look for numbers, to bake with them because they're thinking about numbers and all of that, and look for different things so that we're constantly exposing them to numbers. If we're not having these conversations with them because we're afraid, it's kind of like saying, I'm afraid of messing up with math, so you need to protect me from numbers for the rest of my life.
Mhm.
That's not going to work. It's not feasible. So instead, we want to think about, okay, I make mistakes in math, and how do we learn from math? So I would do that with the younger kids, thinking about, picking one of those topics. So it'd probably be same and different with really little kids. So same and different is one of the lessons I have up on my website is apples are all apples, but different apples look differently and taste differently. So they're all apples, but they taste different, and we like them with different things. So it's just teaching them that you can have a label that covers everybody while also recognizing the differences within. So it's working against that part of our culture where it was I don't see color, which was code for I'm not being racist or discriminatory. Um, and what we know is that we need to see color because we need to honor who's the totality of who somebody is, but we need to treat that as if it is of equal support and value and care and all of those things. So that's how I talk about same and different with them. I might have like a bucket of Lego. All these are Lego, but by the way, a second grader corrected me recently because I always said Legos. And he was like, I always tell kids when I mess up, tell me. He's like, I just want to tell you, it's Lego. Uh, Thank you, Jimmy. I will not mess that up again. But I might have a bucket of Lego and say, look, all these, they're all Lego. They're different shapes. They do different things. And by working together, they can do something different. And so just trying to find all those metaphors and getting them into it. If I wanted to have second graders, first and second graders be equity detectives, I would first spend a lot of time making sure they understand equity. I would also make sure they understand that if they notice an situation that is not equitable or is not an example of equity, that they're not shaming that person, but they're rather looking at it as an opportunity to learn. And then, so I would take that. And then as they get a little bit more into the conversation, I would want to start building the skills for how do you talk about it when you notice that? How do you say that to somebody in a way that shows kindness and care, but also clarity?
Mhm.
So you just build those on top of each other.
Love that. I love that. And then did they report their when they found things, and how in that I would imagine that was just like this amazing opportunity for dialogue.
Mhm. Yep. So in this case, the teachers, the first day they had them report the next day. Then they had them wait a couple of days and they had them write down what they saw, but they didn't share it in morning meeting. Because what we're trying to get them to do there was to think about the emotions you have when you first see it versus when it's further away in time. Because we can talk ourselves into thinking something doesn't matter because it doesn't matter as much to us at that time. So it was a series of those kinds of conversations, and it started with the terminology. Then it was, what are we looking for in ourselves? We also had to look for ourselves. That was a whole other section. Um, and then what language are we using when we notice it? And we also talked to the parents because we said they're going to notice it in you and they're going to say it to you because that's what they're doing. They're not trying to make you feel badly. They're just saying what they're seeing. So here's what here's some ways you can respond to that. We're not saying you're a bad person. We're just trying to help your kids learn other language.
I love that. I love calling it another language.
Yeah.
Right, and really identifying that. Okay, so you're talking about terminology.
Mhm.
I know this is an area that people can feel overwhelmed. Can you give us 5 or 6 words and their definitions and I want you all to know that Jen's not prepared for this. I'm totally putting her on the spot.
None of these examples.
Right. And I mean, it's just an abundance, a wealth of knowledge and expertise here. But what what are the words we have to know that we should as educators,
Mhm.
and the definitions, because so often I find that things can be charged and then I hear you talk about them and it lands differently because you've helped us to understand these concepts without there being any shame or any guilt. You manage to make, and this is, I call it, you make everyone right.
Oh, thank
Right?
you.
When you can make everyone right in the conversation,
Mhm.
there's this ability for everyone to learn together. As soon
Mhm.
as somebody's being made wrong, then it's over because our brain shuts down and our nervous system gets engaged and right, all those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, Montessori education has never been this way. I'm not Montessori trained, just so folks know. I am a counselor in a Montessori high school, so I'm learning. But Montessori's never been the sage on the stage and the side guide on the side teaching. So for those who are not teachers, it's the way of teaching where the teacher's in the front of the room delivering information, and that was very true in education for a long time, still is in some ways. Then we really moved toward project-based learning so that children are working together much more to solve problems and develop ideas, and also sage on the stage where the teacher is more guiding, and then within that, the students are creating the content. So if we think about it very similarly, we want to, if we're going from when we are, if we're talking about it in a way that feels at all charged or triggering, then we're not learning. So we have to remember that and help people to, one thing I love to talk with kids about is when you notice in your wherever it is that you feel your feelings in your body, when that's happening, let's listen to it. Because if you get to the point of feeling badly, then we're not going to do you any good. And then adults will walk away saying, I told them not to do that, but the kids couldn't absorb it. So when I think about things, words that I think everyone needs to understand, pretending I have a dream school, everyone would understand that bias is just a way of sorting and categorizing. It's just a thing. And we do it all the time. We walk out. I this morning I flew home and I went to the parking garage and I could not remember where I parked my car, so I immediately started looking for cars the same color as mine. A way of sorting and categorizing. It's the same thing. What we do with our biases is what's important. And um, what I'm going to say now is a heavy lift. So just going to encourage listeners to just take a deep breath. Any identity we don't hold. So I am a white woman who's heterosexual and I'm middle aged. So any identity that I don't hold, that I'm not intimately familiar with, that I haven't really experienced, I have bias about people who hold that identity. So I have bias about men, about, sexual orientation, about older people, younger people, because my brain is not familiar with any of that. It's what I do with those biases. So since I know that, I can do a lot of work to understand how do I get that to not drive my behavior. So you can put a little thought in there to like, it's like interrupting. One big thing is to give yourself time. If somebody says something that gets you going, like take a deep breath, take a minute. Then you can have a response rather than a reaction. A response is cognitive and it's more of a decision. A reaction is in the moment, words coming out and often creates more harm. So even having a script like this is a lot. I need a minute before we talk about it. That would be helpful. Privilege is also a word I wish we would take the stigma out of it and just acknowledge it. And I said a little bit earlier, I think of privilege in three buckets. The first is ascribed, and that's just what society gives us. So, and we can't do anything about it as an individual. I can't do anything as an individual about the fact that as a white person, I do not have to fear harm to myself for my race. I can't, as an individual, I can't change that. I need to know that it's true and I can't change that. I also need to acknowledge it as a woman, especially a woman who travels by myself a lot. That is something that I have to be concerned about. So I don't have gender privilege, but I do have racial privilege. These all are part of who we are. And then also for us to understand that having a privilege and not having a privilege doesn't cancel them out. So, for example, if I'm working with white folks, almost every time, well, I'll ask you, Tamara, almost every time, if I say, people say, I don't have white privilege because I grew up, what do they usually say?
Or
Yeah, poor. And so that's a severe lack of socioeconomic privilege. And so there are challenges with that. I grew up really poor, like no electricity, no running water, and a school bus. But I still never had to worry about being harmed as a white child in that way, for that reason, for my race, or as a white adult for my race. So my lack of socioeconomic privilege does not take away from the presence of my white privilege. And this is more true for white folks. For folks of color, it can sometimes be the reverse because of how society sets it up, because we often look at somebody and decide things about them. But I can't take that away, and it doesn't get rid of it for me. So I need to acknowledge that all of those are true, and those are just things. Again, it's what I do with it. So now, if I know that I have privileges, and therefore I know I have biases, now I'm the only one who can choose how I operate around that bias and privilege. I'm the only one who can tell my story about it. I'm the only one who can act from it. And in that way, and when I'm working with kids, it's very empowering. It's like I can't go to you as a child and use my age privilege and tell you to believe something different because I'm older than you. No, you have that. You're the only one who can do that. And so it's that way. That's what I really wish people would focus on. And then the third is role privilege. And that's where, as adults in children's lives, we have privilege. They're going to operate differently around us because we're adults. The example I've used in my book is, when I was a principal, people had literally changed their conversation because I was walking by because that was my role. But when I was in a grocery store and my children were tantruming, nobody would say, "Oh, it's okay. She's a principal." It would. So that changes all the time. Role privilege changes a lot, and we need to be really aware of it, and be very mindful of its use because we can also use it for good. Like, I'm going to use my role privilege now and speak to this, which is something that I like to teach third graders about. That's where the language around equity comes in. That was a whole lot. I don't think I gave you five or six, but
Oh, those were great. I mean, that's exactly what we need. And I think there's I think there's a lot of concern coming up, at least in our community, from families feeling like we have this agenda
Mhm.
with the students and that we are going to, particularly, I think around white privilege came up yesterday, that
Yeah,
make the children wrong, have a sense of guilt around that. I'm also hearing that people are concerned that we have agenda around um, gender issues and
mhm,
really pushing um, a trans agenda.
mhm.
That has come up for us recently. So and I know that this is something that schools are facing as we step
Absolutely.
into this work. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I work all over the country. I'm going to London on Sunday. I work in multiple countries, and every school that I know of is struggling with new understandings. And I've been a counselor for 30 plus years, and so I remember when we were having the same conversations about sexual orientation.
Mm.
It's all the same stuff, right? And when we were talking about desegregation, it was also the same language. It's the same language and this, different treatment and different impacts because there's some identities that don't have to be visible and some that are. But we're using the same language, and it's often a presumption of fear and agenda around transgender. There's so much misinformation. There's thoughts about surgical transitions which do not happen with children, and but there's thoughts that there are, and so a lot of it is misinformation. That was the same conversation we had about sexual orientation, 20, 25 years ago. Some still now, of course, but it was, if a teacher says they're gay, they're going to make kids gay. And so it's a lot of that. And I think what we need to do is where I've seen schools mess up, and by mess up, I mean like we all mess up, and that's a good thing when we learn from it, is they come at it from gender identity. We're going to talk about gender identity, but that's like teaching geometry when you have not been sure that somebody knows one plus one is two. And
Mhm.
so you got to go back and explain why identity is important, how children need to feel comfortable with the totality of who they are, and that we can't change their brains. There's no research that shows that we can change their brains. Otherwise, I'd walk around telling them all they're math geniuses, and and they'd all be math geniuses. Where that research gets confused, where the narrative around that research gets confused, is that we do know that when there are books with folks represented in them who are transgender, um, some kids may go, "Oh, that's what it is," and they now have language to attach to an experience that they've had. That doesn't mean the book made them that way. It means the book allowed that the book was doing what books are supposed to do. Give you a window in and see your experience in each other. That's what we want from books. So I think we really need to think about this in the larger context that we're always dealing with difficult conversations. I also want to disconnect the word issues from any of these, because race and gender and sexual orientation, they're not issues. It's their identities. And so even just removing that word, I think helps us to see them a little bit differently. But also, if you're talking about something like something that's different, don't start with that. Start with, all the other ways that you're teaching them that things are different, and build on the skills that you already have and that the teachers already have. They know how to teach the, and parents do too. They know how to teach things in a step-by-step fashion, ensuring that the base is solid and then building on top of it. This is no different. So we don't want to start with telling them they're going to learn geometry later. We want to start with, one-to-one correspondence. And
Hmm.
it's not that simple, I know, but I really think this is one of our big issues. We're coming at something. I always like to look for the most benign access point and start there and then go forward. And we're coming at it from the end of the sequence and not from the beginning.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so I have one more. I know we're running out of time, and I could talk to you for 6 hours. Just want you to know. In fact,
I
we're gonna
could
have
with
to have
you
you back.
too.
But okay, so I'm going to push on something that has been coming up for our families. I've heard this from several people, but there there is a concern when you see the statistics right now on people who have transitioned
Mhm,
and then who are the suicide rates are higher. So
mhm,
the concern is what has been articulated to me is you have a child who's struggling. They
mhm,
say, "Okay, I'm struggling. I think this is going to help me."
mhm.
And then that doesn't help them, and they end up in a position where they've made this life choice. Now, I know that is the extreme, but I
Yeah,
have to share with you how often that is coming up, and
mhm.
I think it would be so helpful to have your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a confusion of facts and myths in that, um, first, just I always like to define language. Transgender means the sex you're assigned at birth when somebody looked at you, and most likely your genitalia, and said you're a boy or a girl, is not how you see yourself. And it's in your head. It's how you see yourself in your head. It's not body and all that. Transitioning is when you live your gender, your authentic gender. So where some of the mythology is that a lot of adults look at transition the way they think of an adult transition. And frankly, our societal references when we were growing up are few and far between and not good. I mean, the only examples I had were Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that wasn't even transgender, so that's and that wasn't even exactly what we're talking about. So that's not what we're talking about. When children say that they are not the gender that they have been identified as, and they want to change that, what most children are doing, because there's not surgery for kids, doctors aren't
Right,
going to do that. What
right.
children are doing is they might change their pronouns, they might change their name, and they might change their gender expression, how they present themselves, hair, clothing, accessories. Several things get confused. People think if they're changing their gender expression, they're also trans. Not true. Maybe those connect, maybe those run parallel, but they're not the same. I think of them as different strands of DNA that braid together to be who we are. Um, and of course, as a society, we're more accepting of somebody who's identified as female dressing more masculine than we are somebody identified as male dressing more feminine. And we make up all kinds of narratives about them. So that's all, we want to sort that out and be realistic about it and recognize the differences there. There is a dramatically increased suicide rate of people who are in the LGBTQ plus community. but there's no research, there's nothing, significant. You can find a couple studies here and there, but we have not found anything significant that says it is because of those identities. What is because of is lack of support, lack of access, and lack of belief in themselves. That's what it's about. And that's why, one of the large, I do a lot of work with people experiencing homelessness. And one of the largest group of homeless folks that people experiencing homelessness that we have are youth. And of that group, many of them are LGBTQ plus. And of that, many of them, it's because their families weren't accepting, or they thought they weren't going to be accepting. That happens too. So it's not, if you're in the LGBTQ community, you necessarily have a higher level of suicidal ideation. It's that being in that community and not having acceptance increase and access increases the statistics for you.
Mhm.
So if families are really trying to, and that's an access point, by the way. When I worked with a school this year and they said we want to talk about gender identity, and I asked all the questions, what have you been doing? And I said, you're not ready yet, so can we do some other things first? Because I'm not of the community, so I don't go too far into that. I do a lot of just like, here's names and words and facts and how you can talk about it. um so, but what they had been focusing a lot in the beginning of the year was mental health. So I came at it from that perspective. You're talking about mental health and prevention, recognition of mental health concerns, recognitions of symptoms, and how do you get help? How do you ask for help? How do you be a helping person? And let's look at all the elevated risk factors and recognize that LGBTQ plus community is one of those elevated factors. So
Mhm.
that's the access point through mental health.
Oh my goodness, there's so much. There's so much for us to talk about, Jen. This was fabulous, fabulous. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. It just so much information, and clearly this is so deeply. You think about this so deeply, and I just so appreciate you spending time with us.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning, Jen has a few books out now. Jen,
No, I have one coming, but one out.
okay, so tell us about your books. You have to take a
So
moment. Just yeah,
yeah, so my well, can I just add one other thing first? Is that okay?
of course, of course.
I just also, I should have said this in the beginning. I literally ran from my car being on the side of the road to record this. So I neglected what is most important to me to start every workshop with. So I'm ending it here, that I know that I have a lot of biases. And so I probably have said something here today that may rub up against one of your identifiers and you're feeling like she doesn't get it. So if that is the case, you are invited to get in touch with me. I always grow and learn from those moments. You could also let Tamara know, or whatever, or you don't have to, whatever feels best to you. But just know that if that happens and you want me to learn about it, please feel free to get in touch. My book is called Hubs Help Us Begin Strategies. It's I was asked to write a DEI book through the ages, and I said that I wasn't comfortable doing so because when I do that work with schools, I always firstly assess, do we have the skills for holding hard conversations? And I always think of it like creating a really strong basket to hold the weightier things. So that book is all, the one sentence strategy is in there, the thinking about your anxiety, taking a deep breath, understanding kids have different conversations now than we are prepared for. All that's in there. And there's strategies that you could use in any situation. They do not have to be specific to a DEI category, because we know in that moment, if we get anxious, we're not going to remember those. So we want strategies that you could use in any situation.
Yeah, and I will tell you, I have it. It's on my bookshelf. It's very good, and I do recommend it. And then tell us about your new book.
So this is thinking about mistake making around these conversations, and then the proactive side of exactly what you started off with, which is so lovely. So I want to pick your brain on the other side of what are ways that we can think about connecting these conversations to the developmental stages that your children are in.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I can't wait for that one to come out. And then
Yeah.
also, as I mentioned before, but do you want to talk a little bit about your podcast?
Yes. And I'd love to have you on. My podcast is called Third Space. Third as in the number, second, third. It's obnoxious, but you have to add with Jen Cort because there are a lot of third spaces apparently. And it's on iHeartRadio. It's on all podcast apps. It is very much like this, except the other way around. I'm in Tamara's role and I'm interviewing students and teachers and specialists and celebrities and people, somebody I met on an airplane who was talking about his racial privilege. It's meant to give you a moment to eavesdrop on a conversation about some of these topics. And they're really clearly labeled. So you could go look at them and see which ones you want to focus on.
Yeah, very, very valuable.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for me. Thank you for the making the early flight and for
Of
making it
course.
up the snowy mountain and all the things to be here. And we just feel so privileged to have you here.
Well, it's a privilege to be asked to be in this space with you, so thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And to our viewers, we want to say, and our listeners, thank you all so much for being here and spending time with us today. You can find all of the information on Jen and her website and her podcast and her all of her details on our show notes. You can also find them on our website at greenspringcenter.org. We invite you to subscribe to our Facebook page and our Instagram page and all of those good things. The work you do is so important. I think it's the most important. We are out together. We are changing the world here, people. So
Yes.
hang in there. Thank you for your work, and we'll see you next time.